The Locked Room. Chapter 1. A House Forgotten by Time. Emma Laroche arrived in the quiet village of St. Martin on a cold morning in early spring. The air smelled of wet stone and old wood, and the streets were nearly empty. She had come to work in the municipal archive, a small building filled with boxes of forgotten papers, faded maps, and handwritten letters. Emma was 34 years old, calm and focused, with a deep love for history. She had spent years studying old records and restoring damaged documents. She liked silence, order, and the feeling of uncovering something lost. Her work was slow, but it gave her peace. She had no family nearby and preferred to live alone. Her world was made of paper and memory. The archive was located near the center of the village, but Emma often walked to the edge of town during her breaks. There, she noticed a house that stood apart from the others. It was large, made of stone, with tall windows and a steep roof. The garden was wild, and the shutters were closed. The house looked forgotten, as if no one had touched it for many years. Locals didn't speak about it, and when Emma asked, they only said it had belonged to a man named Jean Delacroix. He had disappeared in 1952, and no one knew what had happened to him. The house had remained empty ever since. Emma's curiosity grew. She searched the archive for records about the house and found a folder with old property documents. Inside was a small key, labeled with the address. There was no warning, no restriction. The key had simply been left there, waiting. Emma hesitated, but the pull was strong. She had always believed that places held stories, and this house felt like it had something to say. One afternoon, after finishing her work, she walked to the house with the key in her coat pocket. The wind was quiet, and the sky was pale. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was heavy with dust. The floor creaked under her feet. Furniture stood covered in white sheets, and the walls were lined with bookshelves. Everything was still. It felt like the house had been frozen in time. Emma moved slowly, looking at the objects left behind. There were old photographs, broken clocks, and stacks of papers. A coat hung by the door, untouched for decades. She felt a strange tension in the air, as if the house was watching her. It was not fear, but something deeper. A sense that she had entered a space where time had stopped moving. She walked through the rooms, noticing how carefully everything had been arranged. The books were sorted by subject, the furniture placed with purpose. It was the home of someone who valued control, someone who lived with precision. But there was also something missing. No signs of warmth, no signs of life. It was a house built for thought, not comfort. Emma reached the staircase and climbed to the second floor. The hallway was narrow, and the doors were closed. She opened one and found a study, filled with papers and strange diagrams. Another room held medical books and glass jars. The house was not just a home. It had been a place of work, of research. Emma stood in the hallway and listened. There was no sound, but she felt something beneath the silence. A question, waiting to be asked. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she had found the beginning of something. The house was not empty. It was full of memory, full of mystery. And she had stepped into its story. She closed the door behind her and walked back to the archive, the key still in her hand. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of the house stayed with her. The dust, the silence, the strange feeling that time had stopped. She knew she would return. She knew the house had more to show. And she was ready to listen. Chapter 2. The Room Without a Door. Emma Laroche returned to the house the next morning. The air was colder, and the sky was covered with thick clouds. She brought a flashlight, a notebook, and copies of the old blueprints she had found in the archive. She wanted to study the layout of the house more carefully. Something about the second floor had stayed in her mind. There was a hallway with 5 doors, each leading to a bedroom or study. But between 2 of the rooms, there was a long stretch of wall that didn't match the rest. It looked too smooth, too clean, as if it had been built more recently. The wallpaper was different, and the surface didn't show the same cracks or stains. Emma tapped the wall gently and heard a hollow sound. She walked back and forth, measuring the space. According to the blueprints, there should have been a small room there. But there was no door, no sign of entry. Emma didn't want to act too quickly. She spent the afternoon comparing the house to the drawings. The blueprints were old, but clear. They showed a narrow room between the 2 bedrooms, marked as storage. It was not connected to any other part of the house. She checked the floor and ceiling, looking for clues. There were no vents, no openings. It was as if the room had been sealed. She felt a strange tension in her chest. The house had already given her a sense of mystery, but this was something else. A space that existed, but was hidden. A room without a door. She decided to speak to a local carpenter named Henri, who had helped restore buildings in the village. He was quiet and careful, and he agreed to come with her the next day. Together, they examined the wall. Henri confirmed that the surface had been added later. The wood behind it was newer than the rest of the house. He tapped along the edges and found a weak point. With Emma's permission, he began to remove the panels. It took several hours, but finally, the wall opened. Behind it was a narrow passage, dark and cold. At the end of the passage stood a metal door. It had no handle on the outside. The lock was old and rusted, but it had been turned from the inside. Henri worked slowly, using tools to open it without damage. When the door finally creaked open, Emma stepped inside. The room was small, with no windows and thick stone walls. The air was dry and heavy. There were shelves along both sides, filled with journals. Each journal was labeled with a number and a date. The handwriting was neat, and the covers were clean. There was a desk in the corner, with a broken lamp and a stack of blank paper. The room had no signs of life, no clothes, no food, no personal items. But it felt used. It felt like someone had spent a long time there. Emma picked up one of the journals and opened it. The pages were filled with notes, diagrams, and observations. The writing was detailed and focused. She recognized the name on the first page, Drive. Jean Delacroix. These were his records. She looked around the room again. It was not a storage space. It was a hidden study, a place where someone had worked in silence. The metal door, locked from the inside, suggested that whoever had been there had wanted to stay hidden. Or had been kept inside. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The room was quiet, but it held something heavy. She didn't know what the journals contained, but she knew they were important. She took a few with her and left the rest untouched. Henri helped her seal the wall again, but she kept the key to the metal door. That night, she sat in her small apartment and began to read. The handwriting was calm, but the words were strange. The journal spoke of experiments, of isolation, of the human mind. Emma read until her eyes grew tired. She didn't understand everything, but she felt the beginning of a deeper mystery. The house had hidden a room. The room had hidden a story. And now, Emma had opened both. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew she couldn't turn away. The journals were waiting. The truth was waiting. And she was ready to follow it. Chapter 3. The First Pages. Emma Laroche sat at her desk with the first journal open in front of her. The room was quiet, and the only sound was the ticking of the small clock on the wall. She had placed the journal gently on a clean surface, treating it like something fragile. The paper was yellowed but strong, and the handwriting was clear and careful. It belonged to Dr. Jean Delacroix. His name was written at the top of the first page, followed by the date, March 3, 1950. Emma adjusted her reading glasses and began to read. The first pages were scientific. Dr. Delacroix wrote about his interest in the human mind, especially how it reacted to isolation and silence. He believed that fear was not just an emotion but a pattern, something that could be studied and possibly removed. He called it cleansing the mind from fear. He described experiments with light, sound, and time. He wanted to understand how people changed when they were alone for long periods. His tone was calm, almost cold. He wrote like a scientist, not like someone who cared about the people involved. Emma found his words strange but interesting. She had read many research papers before, but this felt different. It was personal, hidden, and never meant to be shared. As she turned the pages, the tone began to shift. The notes became less formal. Dr. Delacroix started writing about volunteers. He had invited people to stay in the house, in the hidden room, for short experiments. At first, they were asked to sit in silence and write about their thoughts. But soon, the conditions changed. He kept them in darkness. He removed clocks and mirrors. He gave them food through a small slot in the door and asked them to write daily journals. Emma felt uneasy. The doctor described how some volunteers became confused, how they lost track of time, how their writing changed. One name appeared more than once, Lucien. Lucien was described as quiet and cooperative at first. He followed instructions and wrote carefully. But after a few days, his entries became strange. He wrote about hearing voices, about feeling watched, about the walls moving. Dr. Delacroix noted these changes with interest, not concern. He believed Lucien was reaching a pure state of mind, free from outside influence. Emma felt a chill. She read Lucien's words, copied by the doctor into the journal. They were broken, scattered, full of fear. He wrote that he saw people in the room, even though he was alone. He said the silence was loud, that the darkness had a shape. His last entry ended in the middle of a sentence. Emma closed the journal and sat back. Her hands were cold. She looked around her small apartment, trying to feel normal again. But something had changed. The journal was not just a record. It was a window into something dark. She thought about the room, about the metal door, about the shelves filled with more journals. How many people had been inside? How many had written their thoughts, hoping someone would read them one day? Emma felt a mix of sadness and curiosity. She wanted to understand, but she also felt the weight of the truth. She opened another journal, this one dated a few months later. The handwriting was different. It belonged to a volunteer. The pages were filled with questions, fears, and strange dreams. Emma read for hours, losing track of time. She felt pulled into their world, into their silence. She began to see patterns, connections, signs of something deeper. The experiments were not just about science. They were about control, about pushing the mind to its limits. Dr. Delacroix had crossed a line, and Emma was beginning to see how far he had gone. That night, she couldn't sleep. The voices from the journals echoed in her thoughts. She wondered what had happened to Lucian, to the others. She wondered why the room had been sealed, why the house had been left untouched. She knew she had to keep reading. The answers were there, hidden in the pages. But she also knew that the deeper she went, the harder it would be to return. The locked room had been opened, and now its story was unfolding. Emma was no longer just an archivist. She had become part of the mystery. And the first pages were only the beginning. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. Emma Laroche spent the next few days reading more journals from the hidden room. She returned to the house each morning, unlocking the metal door and sitting quietly inside. The air in the room was always cold, even when the sun was shining outside. The stone walls seemed to hold the past like a secret. She brought a blanket and a thermos of tea, but even with comfort, the space felt heavy. The journals were stacked neatly, but their contents were far from calm. Each one told a story of isolation, confusion, and fear. Emma read slowly, trying to understand what had happened in that room. The deeper she went, the more she felt the room changing her. At night, Emma began to have strange dreams. She saw shadows moving through the hallway of the house. She heard whispers, soft and broken, coming from behind the walls. She woke up feeling tired, as if she had not rested at all. Her thoughts became cloudy. She started forgetting small things, where she had placed her keys, what day it was. She told herself it was just stress, just the weight of the work. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The room was not just a space. It was a presence. It was watching her, listening to her, pressing against her thoughts. One afternoon, Emma found a journal with a different kind of handwriting. It was less controlled, more emotional. The name on the first page was Lucian. She had seen his name before in Dr. Delacroix's notes, but this was his own writing. The first entries were simple. He described the room, the silence, the routine. He wrote about the food, the light, the feeling of being alone. But after a few pages, the tone changed. Lucian wrote that the doctor had locked him in for weeks, not days. He had no way to measure time. The light was turned off. The food came less often. He began to hear sounds, footsteps, breathing, voices. He wrote that the walls breathed, that they moved when he closed his eyes. He saw people standing in the corners, people who didn't speak, who didn't blink. He tried to talk to them, but they disappeared. Emma read every word with growing unease. Lucien's sentences became shorter, more broken. He repeated phrases, circled words, scratched out lines. His last entry ended in the middle of a sentence. There was no goodbye, no final thought. Just silence. Emma closed the journal and held it in her hands. She felt her heart beating faster. She looked around the room and imagined Lucien sitting in the same spot, writing with shaking hands. She wondered what he had seen, what he had felt. She wondered if he had ever left the room. Emma began to believe that the experiments were not just scientific. They were cruel. Dr. Delacroix had pushed people beyond their limits, not to help them, but to test them. He had used fear as a tool, silence as a weapon. The journals were not research, they were records of suffering. Emma felt anger, but also sadness. These people had trusted the doctor. They had entered the room hoping to help, hoping to learn. Instead, they had been broken. She left the house that evening with Lucien's journal in her bag. She walked slowly through the village, watching the sky turn dark. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't want to explain. The story was too heavy, too strange. She returned to her apartment and placed the journal on her desk. She sat in silence, thinking about the shadows of the past. They were not gone. They were still there, waiting in the pages, waiting in the room. Emma knew she had to keep reading. She had to understand. But she also knew that the deeper she went, the harder it would be to return. The locked room had opened something inside her. And now, it was not just the past she was facing. It was herself. Chapter 5. Disappearance. Emma Laroche sat in the archive office with a stack of folders spread across her desk. The room was quiet, filled with the soft hum of old lights and the smell of paper. She had spent the last 2 days searching for more information about Dr. Jean Delacroix. The journals she had read were disturbing, but she needed facts. She wanted to understand who he was, what he had done, and why the house had been left untouched for so long. She looked through university records, medical reports, and newspaper clippings. Slowly, a picture began to form. Dr. Delacroix had once been a respected figure in the academic world. He taught psychology at a university in Lyon and published articles about fear, memory, and isolation. His early work was praised for its originality. But something changed in the late 1940s. His research became darker, more personal. He stopped working with colleagues and began conducting private experiments. In 1951, he was dismissed from the university for unethical methods. The report was vague, but it mentioned complaints from students and missing records. Emma found a letter from a former assistant who had warned the administration about strange behavior and secret tests. The assistant had left the university and never spoke publicly again. Emma continued digging. She found a list of names, people who had volunteered for Delacroix's studies. Most were young, curious, and hopeful. But several had vanished. Their families had reported them missing, but no one had been charged. One name stood out: Lucien Moreau. His journal had been the most disturbing. Emma found a police report from 1952. Lucien had been last seen near St. Martin. He had told a friend he was going to help with a research project. After that, he disappeared. No body was found. No answers were given. The case was closed quietly. Emma felt a deep chill. The room in the house was not a lab. It was a prison. People had been locked inside, left alone in the dark, pushed beyond their limits. She thought about Lucien's final words, about the shadows he had seen, about the silence that had broken him. She wondered how many others had suffered the same fate. The journals were not just notes. They were evidence. They were voices from the past, asking to be heard. That afternoon, Emma returned to the house. She walked through the empty rooms, feeling the weight of everything she had learned. She climbed the stairs and stood in front of the hidden wall. She unlocked the metal door and stepped inside. The room was cold, as always. But something was different. The journals had been moved. They were no longer in perfect order. Some were stacked on the desk. Others were open, with pages bent. Emma looked around, her heart beating faster. She had locked the door after her last visit. No one should have been there. She checked the corners, the shelves, the floor. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no broken locks. But the air felt strange. Heavy. She picked up one of the journals and saw a fresh fingerprint on the cover. It was not hers. Someone had touched it. Someone had read it. Emma felt a wave of fear. She was not alone. The house had been silent for decades, but now it was waking up. She didn't know who had entered the room or why. But she knew the past was no longer sleeping. She closed the door and locked it again. She walked back to the village, her thoughts racing. She needed to protect the journals. She needed to tell someone. But she also felt a strange pull, a need to keep going. The mystery was growing, and she was already part of it. Emma was no longer just reading history. She was living inside it. And the shadows of the past were beginning to move. Chapter 6. Locked In. Emma Laroche returned to the house early in the morning. The sky was gray, and the wind was colder than usual. She wore a thick coat and carried a canvas bag filled with folders, a flashlight, and a thermos of tea. Her plan was simple. She would collect the most important journals, take them back to the archive, and contact the authorities. She had read enough. The experiments were dangerous, and the truth needed to be shared. She felt nervous but focused. She had spent the night thinking about Lucien, about the missing people, and about the strange feeling that someone had been in the room. But she told herself it was just fear. She was in control now. She entered the house and walked up the stairs. The hallway was silent. The air felt still, almost too still. She reached the hidden wall, unlocked the metal door, and stepped inside. The room looked the same. The shelves were full, the desk was untouched, and the journals were waiting. She took a deep breath and moved toward the shelves. But before she could reach them, the door slammed shut behind her. The sound was sharp and final. Then came the click of the lock. The light went out. Darkness filled the room. Emma froze. Her heart began to race. She turned and tried the door, but it didn't move. She pushed harder, then pulled, but it was no use. The door was locked from the outside, or maybe from inside. She reached for her flashlight, but it slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor. She dropped to her knees, searching for it in the dark. When she found it and turned it on, The beam was weak. The batteries were low. She sat down on the cold floor and tried to stay calm. She told herself it was a mistake, that someone would come. But deep down, she knew the truth. The room had been designed to hold people. And now it was holding her. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time began to feel strange. There was no window, no clock, no sound except her own breathing. She tried to keep track of time by counting, but she lost focus. She drank some tea and ate a small piece of bread from her bag. Then she found a notebook and a pencil on the desk. She began to write. She wrote about the door, about the silence, about the fear growing inside her. She described the cold, the darkness, the way her thoughts felt slower. Writing helped her stay grounded. It gave her something to hold on to. But the room was not quiet. Not completely. She began to hear sounds, soft footsteps, like someone walking slowly across the floor. She turned her flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing there. She heard breathing that wasn't hers. She felt a presence, something just out of sight. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the mind. But the fear was real. The room was doing something to her. It was pressing against her thoughts, bending her sense of time and space. She felt like she was floating, like the walls were moving closer. She kept writing. She wrote about Lucien, about the journals, about Dr. Delacroix. She wrote that she now understood what the others had felt. The room didn't just trap the body. It trapped the mind. It made you question what was real. It made you feel like you were disappearing. She didn't know how long she had been inside. A few hours? A day? More? Her flashlight died, and the darkness became complete. She sat in silence, holding the notebook, listening to the sounds that may or may not have been real. Emma thought about her life outside the room. About the archive, the quiet streets of the village, the people she had passed but never really known. She thought about the choice she had made to enter the house, to open the door, to read the journals. She didn't regret it. But she wished she had told someone. She wished she had not come alone. The room was not just a place. It was a test. And now she was part of it. She closed her eyes and waited. For what, she didn't know. A sound. A voice. A key. Or maybe just the end of fear. Chapter 7. The Final Entry. The village of St. Martin had grown quiet again. The days passed slowly, and the sky remained gray. Henri, the local carpenter, had not seen Emma Laroche for several days. She had told him she would return to the house one last time to collect the journals and bring them to the authorities. But no one had heard from her since. Henri waited, thinking maybe she had gone back to the city. But something didn't feel right. Emma was careful, responsible, and never disappeared without a word. On the fourth day, he decided to go to the house. The front door was unlocked, just as she had left it. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust floated in the light from the windows. Henri walked through the rooms, calling her name, but there was no answer. He climbed the stairs and stood in front of the hidden wall. The metal door behind it was closed. He knocked, waited, then knocked again. Nothing. He listened closely and thought he heard something, maybe a faint sound, maybe nothing at all. His heart began to race. He grabbed his tools and forced the door open. Inside the room, the air was heavy and dry. The light from the hallway spilled across the floor. Emma was sitting in the corner, her back against the wall. Her eyes were open, but she looked distant, as if she had been somewhere far away. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was messy, and her face was pale. But she was alive. In her hands, she held a journal. It was filled with her own handwriting. She looked up at Henri and whispered that no one should ever enter the room again. Then she handed him the journal and closed her eyes. Henri helped her out of the room and down the stairs. She moved slowly, like someone waking from a long dream. He brought her to the local clinic, where she was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. The doctor said she had been inside the room for at least 3 days. She had no serious injuries, but her mind was fragile. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were quiet and careful. She said the room had changed her. She said she now understood what had happened to Lucien. The journal she had written was later read by a small group of researchers. It was not a scientific report. It was a personal record of fear, loneliness, and confusion. Emma had written about the silence, the darkness, and the strange feeling that time had stopped. She described how her thoughts had become slow, how her memories had started to fade. She wrote about hearing footsteps, about feeling watched, about the cold that never left her skin. She wrote that the room didn't just trap the body, it trapped the mind. It made her question what was real and what was not. It made her feel like she was disappearing. She also wrote about Lucien. She said she now understood his fear, his confusion, his final words. She believed he had been left in the room too long, that his mind had broken under the pressure. She wrote that the room was not just a space, it was a mirror. It showed people their deepest fears and left them alone with them. She ended the journal with a warning. The room should never be opened again. Some knowledge was not meant to be touched. Some places were not meant to be entered. After her recovery, Emma left the village. She did not return to the archive. She moved to a quiet town near the coast and began working in a small library. She no longer searched for hidden stories. She no longer opened locked doors. But she kept the journal with her, a reminder of what she had seen, of what she had felt. She never spoke of the house again. And the house, once again, stood silent at the edge of the village, forgotten by time. But the room remained. Behind the wall, behind the metal door, it waited. Empty, but not silent. Still holding the shadows of the past. Still holding the final entry. Chapter 8. The Truth. After her recovery, Emma Laroche packed the journals into a large box and sent them to the psychology department at the University of Lyon. She included a letter explaining where she had found them and what had happened inside the hidden room. She did not describe everything in detail, but she made it clear that the experiments had gone far beyond science. She asked the university to study the materials carefully and to make sure the truth was not forgotten. Then she stepped away. She did not want to be part of the investigation. She had already seen enough. Weeks later, she received a letter from one of the professors. It was written with respect and caution. The team had reviewed the journals and confirmed that Dr. Delacroix's experiments were highly unethical and dangerous. They found notes about sound frequencies used in the room, low vibrations that could not be heard but could be felt. These sounds, combined with darkness and isolation, could cause hallucinations, confusion, and fear. The room had been designed to break the mind slowly, without violence. It was not just a place of study. It was a psychological trap. The scientists also found evidence that Delacroix had tested the room on himself. In one of the final journals, his handwriting changed. He wrote about hearing voices, about seeing people who were not there. He believed the room had opened a door inside his mind. He wrote that fear was not something to be removed, but something to be respected. His last entry ended with a single sentence: "The silence is louder than I imagined." After that, there were no more notes. No one knew what had happened to him. His body was never found. Emma read the letter and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She had not imagined it. The room had real effects. The fear, the confusion, the sounds, none of it was just in her head. But knowing the truth did not make her feel better. It made her feel smaller. She thought about Lucien and the others who had entered the room and never come back. She thought about how easy it was to cross a line without knowing it. Curiosity had brought her to the house. Curiosity had opened the door. But it had also taken something from her. She moved to a quiet town by the sea and started a new life. She worked in a small library, surrounded by books and silence. She no longer searched for hidden stories. She no longer followed strange paths. She lived simply, with care. Sometimes, she thought about the house in St. Martin. She wondered if it was still standing, if someone else would find the room. But she never went back. She had learned that some places are not meant to be opened. Some truths are not meant to be known. The journals were stored in a secure archive at the university. They were not made public. The professors agreed that the information was too dangerous to share. They wrote a short report about the risks of sensory deprivation and the effects of isolation, but they did not mention the house or the room. They closed the file and locked it away. The story ended quietly, without headlines or attention. But Emma knew the truth. She carried it with her, not as a burden, but as a lesson. She had looked into the dark, and the dark had looked back. She had survived, but she had changed. She had learned that knowledge is not always light. Sometimes it is a shadow. And sometimes the most important choice is to walk away. Moral: truth can be dangerous if approached without care. Some doors are closed for a reason. Curiosity is a strength, but without limits, it can lead to losing yourself. Sometimes, to protect the mind, you must let go of the need to know everything. And if you look into the dark, be ready. It might look back at you. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.